to see some really major problems. And I think it's only by these sorts of changes at community level, the messages that get through to that, to the politicians around the world, that we'll see the international agreements that we need to try to reduce emissions to keep us from getting into really dangerous changes to the world's climate system. For New Zealand again, New Zealand's not as vulnerable as many places, but this is some work that was done largely by New Zealand and Australian scientists looking at how vulnerable we would be to various degrees of warming. Essentially what it's saying here is that if we had a couple of degrees of warming compared to pre-industrial, and as I've said, we've already had nearly a degree of warming, then we would be getting into real water security problems in some parts of Australia and also in some parts in the east of New Zealand. And the other thing that's quite vulnerable are coastal communities from the sort of sea level rise that's being talked about if we had a couple of degrees or so of warming. And natural ecosystems are quite vulnerable to climate change as well. In terms of food, for example, New Zealand, work we've done at NIWA suggests, for example, dairy and meat production would go down in some parts of the country, but it might increase in some others. On the west coast and Southland, if there's still plenty of rainfall, it's a bit warmer, the grass grows for longer, we might actually produce more food. So New Zealand's not looking too vulnerable about food, but we are vulnerable in some of these other areas. So that takes us on to Code Red, I guess, and I was very interested to see the list, which I think there's copies that many of you will have now, of the sort of activities that we can do to reduce our own contributions to the emissions of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Now I've just listed a few there, but I think the material that Code Red people have put together gives you a lot more information on that. You know, one of the big ones really is reducing emissions from energy use, whether it's the energy we use to drive our cars around, or it's the energy that we use to heat our houses. In New Zealand, I know 60 or 70% of our energy comes from hydropower, but a substantial chunk does come from burning fossil fuels. And if we keep building houses that use more and more energy, that's going to put more and more pressure on using fossil fuels. So things that we can do to reduce energy in our homes and in our businesses are pretty important. Transport, and I was pleased to see the bus out there and to hear about bicycles. I ride a bicycle in Wellington, and I think, you know, there is opportunity for much better use of public transport. We've heard a bit about the fact that trees soak up carbon dioxide, and if we get more regeneration of native bush and cover more area in trees, that helps as well. The big issue for New Zealand, which I guess you can't do too much about in Code Red, is that something like 50% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture. A lot of that is methane from ruminant animals like cows and sheep, and that's very difficult to reduce. There's a lot of research effort going on at present to try and look for ways to do that, but that's a big issue for New Zealand, a big problem for us. So that's really all I had to say. I think Code Red, as I've said, is a really good thing to be doing. I'm looking forward very much to seeing how it works, and I hope it does get picked up in other parts of the country. I'd really like to congratulate you on taking it on, and wish you all the best for it. And now, if any of you have any questions, I'd be pleased to answer them.
Effectively, you're preaching to the converted here, anyone who's turned up sort of semi-wired up anyway. How's our current government thinking along lines like this? Because they always got the impression it just wasn't in their framework because they want to grow.
Yeah, well, I was told this was going to be a business launch, and I had to wear a suit today for some other reasons, but I was expecting a group of elderly people wearing suits and be very critical about this. So for me it's nice to have an audience like you, but you're quite right. I mean, you know, I think and Nelson is a very progressive place as well in many ways, so I suspect the audience here is much more familiar with the issues I've been talking about than some of the audiences I talk to. In terms of where the government's going, I suspect if Dr. Smith gets here, he's really the person to ask that. Sorry, I'm sort of sidestepping. That's up to you. Yes?
Well, I'm just not quite going to let you sidestep it quite as much, because I think one of the great things about Code Red is that it demands that we make changes in our personal lives and our business operations.
issues. But I think it sensitises us to the possibility of political action at the national level too, and motivates us to push our government in that direction. I want to understand better what are the messages that we should be sending the government. What positions do we want them to take at Copenhagen, for example? I need to understand these, what we should be asking for. Can you help with that?
I can try a little bit. I think, first of all, I think irregardless of which party is it.